Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this webinar where we are presenting our Internet Security Report of the second quarter of the year. Let's check a few things before we start. You can join this webinar through the computer or through dial-in. We will have, you can use the Q&A box where you can make all the questions that you want. An important thing, we are recording this webinar and we will share it with you in the upcoming days. Also, we will publish this in our website so you can check it there anytime you want. And for partners, you can get CPE credits if you join this webinar. And now I'll leave you with Corey and Mark. I hope you enjoyed this webinar.
Thank you, Alicia, so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining today, whatever time it is for you guys, whether evening, afternoon, or morning. Thank you very much for taking your time to join us. As Alicia mentioned, today we'll be talking about the Internet Security Report that we do here at WatchGuard every quarter to keep our thumb on the pulse of the malware and attack trends and share some of the data we learn. But before we do, let me quickly introduce myself. My name's Corey Nachreiner. I was previously the Chief Technology Officer, but now also have added the title of Chief Security Officer for WatchGuard Technologies. As the CTO, I still retain those duties. I do a lot of M&A for WatchGuard, but I also run our threat lab, really my passion, a team I started on myself that Mark leads up, which he'll talk about in a moment. And of course, as the Chief Security Officer, I now manage the security of WatchGuard along with my threat lab team. So we know the same pressures a lot of you MSP partners or customers out there have to secure your own networks. But Mark, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thanks, Corey. And again, thanks to everyone else for hopping on. Like Corey, I'm a man of many hats too at WatchGuard. I've been here about 10 years in quite a few different roles and responsibilities. And like Corey mentioned, recently we've taken on the mantle of securing our own organization, which is a very fun problem to tackle. But also, like Corey, my main passion comes from way up in the ivory tower of the research and analytics side of security as well. So I always love putting out these reports every quarter and seeing where the threat trends are lying for that time of year.
And of course, this report also is a lot of work from our entire team. I'll go ahead and let Mark introduce the folks that work from.
Yeah, so we've got quite a few different authors that contribute to this report every quarter now, as it's grown over the past few years from, man, when was our first one? Like Q4 of 2016, I believe, when it was just you and I. To now we get help from everyone else on our team at this point, analyzing different new additions of threat intelligence that we've been able to add to it. This quarter, we've had help from Trevor Collins, John, Josh, Ryan, all sorts of different individuals across the team. And I feel like, man, we definitely wouldn't get this out in time if it wasn't for their assistance as well.
Absolutely, a lot of good work from everyone on the team. So why don't we jump into today's agenda? As always, we're going to be starting with Firebox feed trends. We'll talk about what the Firebox feed is for those that have been on the call before, they probably know. But at the highest level, the Firebox feed is where we get a lot of our analytical and quantifiable information about malware based on different malware detection services we have, as well as network attacks, which is largely based on our IPS, but also services like DNS Watch. Because we have a DNS-based security firewall, we can actually see when users go to malicious domains. In this report, you know, as I guess I can't say recently anymore since it's been well over a year, but as many of you know, we acquired an endpoint security company, a very fantastic 30-plus-year company, Panda Security, a while ago. And while we've only had their information in one of our reports before, we are happy to return it this quarter with, I think, a full half year of information from some of the endpoint products as well. So it's very interesting to see the different view that an endpoint has for malware versus a network. As you'll learn, in the network, we often see the dropper or the initial stage of malware, but not necessarily the child malware, the final malware that ends up on the computer. So you'll see slightly different trends from the endpoint. We also like to cover in our report a top security incident for the quarter. For this time's sake wise, we probably won't cover this incident in much detail because we've done a big webinar on it, but we'll at least cover it in a high level and share a link where you can actually go and check out the webinar that covers this quarter story in quite even more depth probably than the report. And finally, the whole point of this, the reason we follow these trends is really more around giving you ideas to defend yourself in the future. Malware and attacks continue to evolve. So we want to make sure to know what the bad guys are doing so we can adjust our defenses accordingly. With that said, let's jump right into the Firebox feed, and I'll go ahead and let Mark introduce it.
Yeah, and so for those that haven't attended one of our webinars on this or haven't had a chance to check out the security report before this quarter, a real quick overview of the Firebox feed is it's basically our threat intelligence source from our customers and partners that have chosen to opt in to sharing this information with us. When you set up a Firebox through its quick setup wizard or go into the general settings of it, either through the web UI or WatchGuard System Manager, you'll see a little checkbox that says send device feedback to WatchGuard. And while that sends information based off of like usage to help product management figure out where to focus their attention for the upcoming year, it also sends us a incident report anytime one of these security services on the Firebox triggers and blocks a threat. And when we say security service, the bulk of our information comes down to around, I guess, 5 now different sources off the Firebox itself. Starting with our 3 layers of anti-malware. So that's Gateway Antivirus, which is the signature-based, heuristic-based anti-malware engine that's really good at quickly and efficiently catching just the noise, the known threats out there. But as you'll see later in this report, it alone is not enough to catch the overwhelming majority of malware out there in the modern threat landscape. So backing that up is Intelligent AV, which is our machine learning-based engine where we run it through a machine learning model, and it can quickly predict thumbs up or thumbs down whether any payload is going to be bad or good. And then backing that up, though, is our APT blocker engine, which is a behavioral sandbox-based engine where it'll take a potentially malicious file or something the Firebox isn't sure about and send it up into a cloud-based sandbox and detonate it and just watch the behaviors. Because at the end of the day, malware it's malicious software. It's going to do something bad. And if you can identify those malicious behaviors, you can have a pretty strong determination on whether it's going to be bad or good. Outside of the malware engines, though, we also take in information from our intrusion prevention service. So looking for network exploits or exploits against really any application or service that interacts with the network at any level. This could be a web server application. It could be your web browser connecting out to the internet. We take a look at the threat trends targeting those services as well. And then also, I guess not really new anymore, it's been in there for a few years, but our DNS Watch service as well, which is a DNS firewalling service. Does a really great job of protecting users that may have accidentally or unknowingly clicked on a phishing link, or even help detect and block botnet command and control connections trying to leave your network as well. So all of these services put together is what we call the Firebox feed, where every quarter we try and identify the major trends that we see out of this information so that we can give you some actionable intelligence on exactly how to defend against this modern threat landscape. And so I guess with that, let's go ahead and dive into just the high-level overview of malware for Q2. And in general, malware as a whole was actually down around 4% for the quarter. That's despite gateway antivirus detections going up a whopping 10%. I say whopping because when you're getting 9.5 million detections in a quarter, any substantial increase like that is pretty massive. The bulk of the drop in malware volume, though, came from some of the evasive threats actually going down for what feels like the first time in forever. Now, this doesn't mean that...
Can I interject really quick, Mark, just to mention all of these numbers, for instance, that 9 million that went down a little bit, or actually is up for GAV, but down for APT, as Mark will say. Do realize the first thing, this is based on about 37,000 fireboxes. Do know we have anywhere between 350 to 400,000 active fireboxes out there. So if you really kind of want to know the actual numbers, multiply these by 10. But the reason I bring this up is for us to see this data, We're really not trying to get any data about you, your organization, your IPs. Really, all we care about is these malware hits. But you have to kind of opt in when you're setting up the box, or you can go to configuration in the box to sharing this additional information with us. So we would love to see that 37 number go up, and then you would of course see the trends go up too. So I just wanted to do a shout out to anyone who is a Firebox owner today. If you haven't opted into this, we'd really love it. It goes into one, us figuring out what bad guys are doing, but two, product improvements as we learn new techniques they use. Sorry about that, Mark. You were continuing on APT blocker, I think.
Yeah, no problem. And one thing I want to point out is even though malware looks like it's down about 4%, we'll get into a little bit later one of the reasons why it might look like it's down based off of this view, but in reality, it might actually be up for the quarter, just depending on our ability to actually see some of these because of some configuration options some users may or may not have set up. So without spilling the beans on that one, though, in general, like malware as a whole was down for the quarter. And this does kind of follow a cyclical trend that we've seen previously in the quarterly security report, with malware detections tending to trend up towards the latter end of the year and then back down through the middle of the year. We feel like historically sometimes that's been because of just evolutions in user behavior and threat actor behavior around like the holidays and major shopping seasons, for example. It feels like the last 2 years or so, a lot of that has had a wrench thrown into it with this global pandemic and users shifting from behind the perimeter where Gateway Antivirus and APT Blocker would be able to catch threats every day to outside of the perimeter entirely, where their traffic may not even traverse a traditional perimeter appliance at all. And we'll get into the zero-day malware a bit later as well, but even just the share of evasive malware was actually trending a bit down for this quarter compared to previous quarters.
Granted, we will point out the previous quarter, I think, was our all-time high. Q1 had the most zero-day malware. I think Mark will mention it before, but just remember, zero-day malware is basically malware that's caught by the more proactive things like APT Blocker and Intelligence AV, stuff that signature-based detection misses. But I think before we get into the next part, don't you have a polling question, Mark? Oops, let me go back.
Yeah, so we've got a question for you all. For those on the call, do you currently decrypt and inspect HTTPS traffic at your network perimeter? So what we mean by this is, do you set up your Firebox or your other network security appliance as what's called a middle box, where you've set up certificates and certificate management throughout your organization to allow you to then inspect this traffic as it traverses your perimeter, even if it's encrypted. And you got a few different options in here. Do you do it in both directions, inbound and outbound? If you're hosting any web services behind your Firebox, are you just doing it inbound, or are you just doing it outbound through the Firebox? And it looks like the fluctuations are starting to slow down enough that we can probably go ahead and kill the poll and take a look at the results from this one then. And honestly, just looking at the results, they're about right on with what I've seen in our own data that we get from some of the folks that have opted into sharing this with us. And the bulk of it is, I guess the majority are, well, actually, in this case, the majority of you are inspecting, at least in some form, inbound or outbound. And I'll say when it comes to setup for this, inbound is definitely the simpler of the approach, whereas outbound tends to be where the bulk of at least the setup requirements tend to lie. But still, there's a pretty massive 46% of you that aren't inspecting encrypted traffic through your network perimeter. And as you'll see in just a second, that could potentially cause some issues in missing a substantial amount of the malware that's traversing your network. With that, Corey, you want to, there we go. Oh, you're muted, sir.
Sorry, I was making sure that my typing questions wasn't bugging the audience. But thank you, Mark. Yeah, one of the biggest, highest level trends for this quarter that was newish was 91.5% of malware that we detected arrived over encrypted connections. And that number has been relatively large, like at least over 50% many times before. But this 91% was a pretty big explosion compared to previous quarters. And by the way, while it is a little easier to do inbound HTTPS inspection, outbound is the one I would worry about most here. You know, people just browsing the internet And nowadays, it's most often secure websites. You're losing all the security services protections if you're not actually inspecting that with our HTTPS decryption application layer gateway. So big number, it shows that, bad guys get protection from HTTPS. We actually approve of big use of TLS on the internet. It's a way that's going to improve the security and privacy for all of us. But we have to realize bad guys know this and use it too. So definitely something to enable if you have, and it's nice to see that a lot of folks on this call have. Just to give you some random stats, the last time, it's been a few quarters since we looked at this, but I think, the first time we looked at how many people were using this based on the data we have anyways, it was single digit percentages. I think it rose up to 20%, which, believe it or not, that seemed pretty positive that we at least got 20% of folks out there using this capability. But if you think about it, 20% is really only 1/5. It's far too little. Now that HTTPS is the default, all of us should be trying to enable this when possible. We have tried to make it as easy as you can do, so check it out. Besides that, if you break down all of the malware detected, on average, if you break it down between those around 37K fireboxes, each firebox was, blocking around 438 malware variants per firebox. That brings us to, we're going to dive into some details, but every quarter we talk about the top malware by volume, the top widespread malware, and the top encrypted malware, which we'll cover some of those today. This is the list of the top 10 malware we saw this quarter. I'm not going to cover all of these in detail. I will say that our top 10 lists don't change a whole lot. So we pay attention, what I mean by that is a lot of the threats like HIMD, a Windows code injection Trojan, has been showing up on this list over and over again. So we'd rather focus kind of on some of the newcomers, the newish ones. Well, one is AMSI Disable A, one variant of AMSI Disable, which is a PowerShell based threat that actually disables some security in Windows, which I'll talk about later. Related to that, PowerShell, by the way, being one of the scripted or fileless ways of doing bad stuff on your computer, XML.js Loader, by the way, AMS Disable, I think had shown up for the first time last quarter, so it's not completely new, but it keeps on rising on the list. XML.js Loader, very similar. The JS in that means JavaScript, so another script-based loader to kind of filelessly try to start malware, as well as Trojan Agent WDCR. Those were the primary new ones we saw this quarter, and I'll go into at least one of those and one other you'll see on another list coming up in a few slides. Mark, why don't you talk about the encrypted detection, by the way, and a couple of the threats account for a lot of that 91% we shared a second ago.
Yeah, 100%. So we also like to look at some of the threats that arrived over encrypted HTTPS connections. And like Corey mentioned, only around 20% of fireboxes that report into the Firebox feed use HTTPS decryption. And so if that were higher, like if every single network enabled this feature and we're inspecting all of their traffic and identifying all the threats that we're trying to traverse the perimeter, we'd expect a lot of these detections to surpass a lot of the total volume detections that you just saw on the last slide as well. Like, for example, the AMSI Disable verdict was far and away the most widely detected threat. And if you account for the fact that only 20% of boxes potentially identified this one as it was going through their perimeter, like some basic math puts this at like right around 3 times the volume of our #1 threat in total from the previous slide. XML.js Loader, though, which we first identified in Q1 of this year, actually had significant volumes as well, to the point where once you do the math, it shoots way up on the list as well in total volume. The XML.js Loader one's pretty interesting in that it actually abuses XML external entities to run a PowerShell-based dropper. So it's another popular way to kick off a fileless threat on a host or a living off the land threat on a host that's been only growing in popularity over the past few quarters. Agent IIQ is another one that we're going to talk about in just a second. And actually with that, how about I hand it back to Corey to go over a few specific threats from this quarter.
Yeah, of course. So let's talk about the first one I mentioned a second ago, AMSI disable. And the A, by the way, is just one variant. There's probably a B, C, and D. But first of all, this was a PowerShell threat. So this threat came as a PowerShell script. And the AMSI in the name stands for Anti-Malware Scan Interface. What's interesting about this PowerShell is PowerShell threats are very common nowadays. In fact, this threat, like many others, used some of the scripts that is found in PowerSploit. If you look up PowerSploit as one word, you'll find open source GitHubs that have many different PowerShell functions to do malicious things on your computer, like to use DLL hijacking or to inject DLLs in processes running in memory. But this particular threat, besides using some PowerShell to do some other nasty stuff a little later, also had some very specific PowerShell, which we detail in our report, by the way, if you want to know the actual specifics, that disables the anti-malware scan interface. It makes two settings changes, which we detail in the report, that basically turn off Windows's ability. AMSI is all about adding some security scans to PowerShell, to VBA scripts, to JavaScript. As you probably heard in our report from trends over the past year, scripts are very dangerous. Fileless attacks, living off the land attacks are kind of the new norm for attackers. So Microsoft, like many security vendors, including us, want to scan those scripts for badness. And AMSI does that. And basically this PowerShell was able to disable that Windows safety, and thus later on its PowerShell scripts might be able to work on a system that had this disabled. By the way, what this does can be many things. It can inject malware running on your computer or do other stuff. But in general, what we're catching here is the specific PowerShell that is actually disabling AMSI. The next one we want to talk about is Agent IIQ, or JavaScript Agent IIQ, which again is a bit of JavaScript. This was some particularly obfuscated JavaScript. If you looked at it at first, you'd have to do a little deobfuscation to figure out the real script. But our researchers analyzed it, and you can see some of the script in the report. Essentially, this script was trying to create little secret, invisible, bugs in legitimate web pages that would point to a phishing site. So they were trying to hijack Microsoft OWA or Google Workspace. So if you actually look at the script, it would create a little iframe element. If you've heard of iframe before, it's a very legitimate bit of HTML code that's supposed to make a frame on a page of a website. But like a very old iframe trick, this uses a different type of way to make a 0 or a 1 pixel iframe, meaning you can make a frame that's 1 pixel big, people don't physically see, but it's really able to redirect. Iframes can redirect to other sites to another page. And we saw this doing a lot of stuff. Some bad guys use this iframe to kind of move to a drive-by download page that would eventually get to the Emotet botnet. But for the most part, we saw it doing things like forcing to a malicious site that served phishing pages that looked quite a bit like Microsoft OWA or Google Workspace. And we have some pictures in the report where you can see some of the iframes. So those were probably the two biggest threats we saw during the malware during the Q2. But with that, Mark, why don't you go ahead and cover the 0-day?
Yeah, and if for those that have read our previous reports or maybe attended the last webinar, you'd know that last quarter we actually had a pretty massive high of 0-day malware at 73.6%. And like Corey mentioned earlier, when we say 0-day malware, we're not talking about a 0-day vulnerability. It's like an unpatched flaw in an application. We mean malware that got past signature-based anti-malware engines. And that's because it's either brand new, it straight up didn't have a signature, or more commonly, the attacker is using some form of evasion to make it get past some of these signature-based detections. Like you can go online on the dark web or even just underground forums on the internet, or even just GitHub, and download tools like packers and cryptors that can take any old malware payload and make it evasive enough to get past signature-based anti-malware detections. It's easier than ever these days. Like I remember the first time I even tried doing demos, I had to go shell out like $10 to even get one of these. Now there's freely available tools that anyone can use. And attackers are using those. Their malware these days are even better at evading some of these old legacy protection methods. And this quarter, even though it was down to 61.1%, which isn't near that almost 3/4 number from the last quarter, it's still a pretty significant percentage. Like if you think about it on the whole, it's still just about 2/3 of all malware that you'd be missing if you're just using signature-based anti-malware services to try and catch these threats. Now, if you take nothing else away from this, it's a really great example of why you need multiple layers of anti-malware protection to catch most of the modern threats that are out there this quarter and really for the time to come.
Cool. The last thing we want to cover before we transition to network attacks is malware by geographies. So in the report, we have a lot more details here. We tend to break it out at a high level between the Americas, EMEA, which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and then APAC, the Asia Pacific, including, of course, Sydney or Australia and New Zealand. And what you're seeing here is a weighted version of malware by volume in each of these regions. And what I mean by weighted, for instance, if we're going by pure volume, there's about, between all those boxes, we detected about 15.5 million malware samples. Only 1.1 million was in APAC, which is technically probably closer to 7%. But what we've done here is there's different amounts of fireboxes in different countries. So we weight it per firebox, and then you can see APAC does show up a little more than just that meager by volume 7%. That said, you can clearly see APAC this quarter at least actually was trailing quite a bit in malware. Most of the malware we detected was in the Americas, with EMEA following very closely. This is a pretty normal distribution of malware. I will say there's been plenty of quarters where EMEA was #1, and there have been quarters where APAC has gone higher than normal, but this is pretty normal. By the way, before I give Mark over to move on to some of the network attacks, I do want to mention, I'm trying to answer some questions as we go text, but there's a couple questions we'll probably answer in voice later on in the call, so don't think we're ignoring those questions.
Yeah, 100%. So now moving on to the network attack section, where we discuss some of our threats that we detected through the intrusion prevention system on the Firebox, which is looking for signatures of known exploits, targeting either applications hosted behind your Firebox or applications you access through a network-based client, whether it be a browser or some other application on your system. And this quarter, it actually trended up quite substantially. Like we hit just over 5 million detections in Q2 2021. And if you see, like it's been trending up for the past year or so, even with some of the fluctuations up and down of appliances that are opted into this threat intelligence feed, like over the past 2 years specifically, network attacks have been trending upward pretty substantially. And we feel like that one explanation for this is, even though like with this whole pandemic forcing organizations to work remotely or at least transition to a hybrid model these days, while we may see malware detections where the endpoint or the host has to be traversing through the Firebox, trending down, we see network attacks going up because organizations still have to expose a lot of these services to the internet. Like especially with workers working from home, you may have quickly opened up a web portal to one of your applications that your users have to connect into every day. And if you're not doing that securely through something like a VPN, it allows an attacker to just sit there and hammer away at it over the course of a day, trying to brute force and gain access, or port scan your box and find some out-of-date applications that it can just exploit and walk right in through the front door. So it makes sense to see network attacks continue to move up, even if malware detections have kind of fluctuated up and down through the past couple of years. With that, though, let's take a look at some of the, I guess, the overall view of network attacks for the previous quarter. And we've had quite a few new ones this quarter, which is kind of new.
Yeah. So, by the way, we also do widespread we haven't shown you as many widespread lists this quarter, so you should definitely check out the report. This one is by volume, so we're just looking at network attacks, and we do the same for malware by pure volume. When we see our widespread lists in the actual report, that is by the amount of devices being affected. So for instance, you can have a network attack that's affecting one region, maybe even one customer repeatedly, that creates volume that doesn't affect everyone, whereas widespread is something hitting a lot of fireboxes. Anyways, this is our top 10 network attacks for the quarter. As you can see, it's a wide variety, although most of these, one thing we've noticed quarter over quarter is most of the stuff being targeted over the network is web-based stuff, web clients or web servers. There's all kinds of different network attacks, RDP attacks, all kinds of things. But web, as I've said many times over the decade, the web is the battleground. Web application vulnerabilities and web server issues are what a lot of folks target. So this list, like a lot of others, doesn't change a lot. One other thing we notice is there's ones that are kind of generic detection, web SQL injection, all the different types of web cross-site scripting. These are generic signatures that catch signs of a very common web application attack. SQL injection, by the way, mistakes in code of your web server interacting with the SQL backend might allow bad guys to inject SQL queries directly to your backend through your web your front end UI. Same with cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting is there's a couple different types of cross-site scripting, but it essentially, coding flaws in your web application or web server allow bad guys to inject script that your web server runs as though it were its own. So some of the new ones that are not 100% new are things like web cross-site scripting attempt 5A. We have all kinds you can also see the one below, website scripting 36, which has shown up many times. We have lots of generic signatures that catch different signs of cross-site scripting attacks. This is just a new variant that showed up on the list before. The remaining three, are various vulnerabilities that have happened, and a lot of them were from 2011. So I'll just talk about one in particular, but you can see the file pair archive one down there. If you don't know what that is, basically file pair archive is a tar symbolic link handling vulnerability, and pair stands for PHP extension and application repository. So it's kind of just a PHP extension, a very common one. This was a kind of newish vulnerability in 2020. This type of symbolic link handling issue in this PHP extension actually started quite a long time ago and was old, but apparently there's been, what happens sometimes is when the good guys patch some of these flaws, they patch it for a very specific exploit and they think they fixed the problem, but there's a different way that a researcher or a bad guy can target and exploit the underlying problem. And in 2020, it kind of resurfaced as a vulnerability again. So that's a specific vulnerability in a PHP that pair extension that you might add to your web server if you happen to be using PHP in this particular extension for what you do. But long story short for this, I would just say, a lot of what we see in the top list is not as interesting as some of the little more detailed stuff lower below, because we believe a lot of what we see in the top network attacks are because of mass scans. Every researcher in the world is constantly scanning the internet. More importantly, botnets. One of the first things they use their victim to do is to start a mass scan where they take lists of many known exploits, often very old and reliable exploits, that they just scan open ports for the internet. If they find port 80 open and they find, for instance, they see some header that shows that they might be using that PHP extension in particular, pair, they can just automatically launch the exploit against it. So we think a lot of the top network attacks we see are really due to automated scanning, whether from the good guys auditing or the bad guys just using their botnets to scan the internet. Next up, why don't you cover the geographic distribution, Mark?
Yeah, and so when we show this graph, we're actually showing the unweighted percentages this time for network attacks around the world to kind of give you an idea of just how much the weighting kind of tends to shift things. Because once we take into account the number of deployed appliances in the different regions, or at least the ones reporting into the Firebox feed, the numbers change up quite a bit here. Like America goes up to 61.8%. The Europe and the Middle East and Africa goes down to 27%, and APAC comes up to 11.2%. So pretty drastic shifts once we look at the actual volumes and the amount of appliances reporting in. When it comes to some of these trends, though, around the world, like the Americas actually saw 1,744 network attacks per appliance for the quarter. which is a pretty massive amount of threats to be blocking in just a 3-month period of time. And the bulk of these, like Corey said, are automated attacks. Like attackers are just scanning the entire address space of the internet and attempting different exploits against ports that they see open. But it shows that having something as simple as just a intrusion prevention service blocking and protecting your exposed services on your network can go a long ways towards cutting down a lot of this noise and a lot of these threats that are targeting your networks out there. Now, let's go ahead and pivot into the top malicious domains for the quarter. So now, moving on outside of network attacks, we take a look at some of the malicious domains that our DNS Watch service blocked for the quarter. And while there's a whole swath of different categories that we can categorize these as, there's really only 3 that we tend to look at for each quarter after quarter. We bucketed them into compromised websites, so websites that are otherwise legitimate, but have been compromised through either an exploit of a vulnerability they had or some other way to host something malicious. Now, the second category is malware domains. So these are ones involved in the distribution or command and control of malware payloads. And then phishing domains, which is pretty much a gimme there. Websites that are associated with phishing campaigns that maybe your user receives through an email or an SMS message these days, since those seem to be taking off in popularity. There's quite a few domains that come in every single quarter, it feels like, over and over. Like in the malware section, that Talknawal domain I've been talking about for the last month or year and a half now, as associated with the VPN filter malware from, like 4 years ago now. But if we look at just some of the new ones, there's a couple standouts. So you'll notice under the compromised websites, there's a subdomain of archive.org. And for those that aren't familiar with the Wayback Machine, archive.org is effectively a web service that will archive websites as they exist at any given point in time, so that you can go back and see how they looked like 10 years ago. Like I sometimes love poking around watchguard.com and checking how it looked 10 years prior, just to see, what we were talking about at that given point in time. In this specific instance, though, this subdomain of archive.org was actually hosting some malware, because we presume it archived a website that was hosting malware at that point in time. In this case, it was hosting the async rat malware, pretty generic remote access Trojan, but we were able to identify that and block connections going to it from potentially downloading this malware if you got tricked by a threat actor into visiting that link potentially. Now, when it comes to malware domains, the t.awcna.com one was hosting a malware family called LemonDuck, which is, again, mostly a generic remote access Trojan, but it does include some additional modules. We've seen it hosting cryptocurrency mining that it does by exploiting Exchange servers and turning them into a botnet. It feels like Exchange servers have been getting hit left and right over the last year, thanks to vulnerabilities, and just the fact that they're exposed to the internet as part of their function makes them a pretty easy target these days for threat actors to go after. When it comes to phishing,
that, Mark, I was kind of assuming LemonDuck was just some grumpy duck meme.
Sorry, that was a bit of a reach. You can do better than that.
I'll try again. My dad jokes are off today.
Exactly. It's probably because of the soap in your coffee. So when it comes to phishing domains, there's quite a few in here that have popped up time and time again. You'll notice a lot of SharePoint subdomains in here. It's pretty popular for threat actors to abuse cloud hosting services, where they're able to register their own subdomain and then host whatever they want up there, and more often than not, host a phishing campaign that then piggybacks off of the good reputation of that parent domain. Some of the new ones, though, there was a subdomain of FontAwesome, a pretty popular icon and web font hosting platform, where threat actors actually abuse their access there and register a subdomain to host a Outlook phishing campaign in this case. So again, piggybacking off of good reputation to deliver something bad. There was also cspecial-breaking.news, which was actually, you could categorize this as a legitimate website, even though it was used for illegitimate means. It was actually a domain that was used to bypass region restrictions on videos. If you've ever gone on YouTube and seen, oh, this is only available in America or England or whatever, you could use a site like this in order to get around some of those restrictions. But on the flip side, they tend to host a whole lot of other sketchy content, adware, malware, other malicious payloads. In this case, it was abusing some of your browser functionality, like permissions for notifications, to carry out additional malicious or sketchy actions. So we added it to our block list in order to protect our users from visiting that site as well. Long story short, though, if you're not using a DNS firewalling service, you're potentially allowing a lot of these threats through, or at least allowing your users that have fallen for a phish and clicked on a link to visit a otherwise malicious domain. With that, though, for time's sake, let's go ahead and hop into some defensive tips that we can get from our data that we gathered from the Firebox feed for this quarter.
I'm not in the mood to hop. Can I mosey on into the next slide, Mark?
Sure thing.
So let's go over some really high level learnings from this report. The first, let me define something real quick. As I mentioned, WatchGuard acquired a company called Panda Security. One of the main products we got from them is something called Adaptive Defense 360, which is both EPP, that acronym is Endpoint Protection. It's kind of the next generation of AV, very preventative, able to prevent malware, even more sophisticated malware quite well. But it also includes something called EDR, Endpoint Detection and Response. And endpoint detection and response, while it's also a malware detection service, it's more trying to detect malware that sneaks past the preventative parts, stuff that might start to execute. So I think of EDR as post-malware execution detection. And the cool part about EDR, well, I'll get into that in a moment. I do also want to mention from Adaptive Defense 360, we've recently launched the WatchGuard version of that, which is called WatchGuard EPDR. So endpoint, prevention, detection, and response. And it's a combination of AD360. I think we recently launched the modules. Besides providing EPP and EDR, the product also has things that can do patch management, that can do system management, that can do full disk encryption. Many other endpoint security controls all come with this package. In any case, for a lot of the fileless and living off the land threats we talk about, we heavily promote the need for users not to just have basic antivirus, but to have endpoint detection and response technologies like Adaptive Defense 360 or WatchGuard EPDR. And the reason is, again, a lot of traditional malware is focused on looking at files and registry entries, hard indicators of traditional malware that leave footprints, leave files on your computer. But I think there was one question: how do you detect if you actually had something like AMSI disable, that PowerShell running on your endpoint? Well, the answer to that question, Andrea, is to use something like EDR, because EDR isn't just paying attention to files and registry entries, it's paying attention to things that are running and happening on your endpoint right now. That could be monitoring processes as they launch and looking at behaviors. That could be one of the things we have in WatchGuard EPDR is contextual engine rules, where when PowerShell or JavaScript, any sort of script executes, even when the normal Windows command shell runs, those are all potentially legitimate situations, but we pay attention to contextual clues of what they're doing. What actual PowerShell code is being run, what the parameters are, to figure out if it's bad or good. And that contextual engine can catch things like PowerShell-based threats, bad JavaScript, malicious command line things. So a lot of these fileless or living off the land techniques. So we really heavily encourage you, if you're not using an EDR product along with your traditional AV, consider doing so. And of course, WatchGuard can give you both the preventative anti-malware detection and the EDR in one solution.
And while we didn't talk about it in this webinar through the malware section, we actually discuss another threat actor that's attacking Exchange servers as well, and has a history of going after them for the past few years too. So paired with them and the Lemon Duck malware that we just talked about a second ago, like it seems like threat actors these days are going after email servers, largely because, again, they're exposed to the internet as part of their functionality, which makes them an easy target. And also because of the huge amount of potentially valuable information on them. Like we all send potentially sensitive messages through email, and if you're able to get a hold of the server where they're all stored on, you have access to quite a bit of data if you're not protected through other means like encryption and so on and so forth. And basically, while like locally managed non-cloud-based email servers still allow you to keep control of your email messages, they allow you to continue your communications when Office 365 has a rough day, you still need to make sure you're doing your due diligence and installing patches as they come in as quickly as possible, and then enacting cyber defenses to help harden that email server as well. That means everything from the perimeter in front of it, so deploying things like anti-malware layers and intrusion prevention layers, down to the endpoint itself. So using that EPDR that Corey just talked about to try and catch threats that may have slipped through and made it to that endpoint as well. These hardening techniques can basically be the difference between someone popping your email server and gaining a foothold on your network and keeping it safe and keeping the mail flowing.
Cool. And the final tip is kind of talking about some of the IPS or the network attack hits we saw, in particular the pair one I was talking about. One thing is the beauty of something like IPS. I think one of the audience members mentioned that they think IPS is one of the most relevant network security services, and I absolutely agree. It's intended to, all of us know that patching is a very important part of security. But sometimes, patching is hard when you run a very dynamic network. You have certain production requirements with the server that has to use a certain version of something because you haven't had time to update, but it's core to your business. And network protection, IPS in particular, can really plug a vulnerability window gap if there's a known vulnerability in one of your servers. But on top of that, in the case of PAIR, that one vulnerability I mentioned, the symbolic link vulnerability, was something that was found in PAIR long ago, but resurfaced because the fix for it was imperfect. Researchers found a new way to get to the vulnerability that they were exploiting before. And that's a perfect example of why network and endpoint security is a must. Even if you had kept your server or that particular framework patched, if some new way to exploit it comes up, IPS, intrusion prevention, is a good way where once the exploit becomes known, we can create a signature to catch it and prevent it until you can actually catch up and apply the new patch that hopefully they'll release to fix that. And of course, Mark just mentioned how endpoint helps too directly on servers themselves. So do realize that these services are really great for plugging that vulnerability window when bad guys are exploiting these flaws, either because you, for whatever reason, were behind on patches, or one of the vulnerabilities resurfaced in another way. So we'll have some more tips along the way and at the end, but with that, why don't we quickly talk about the story of the month, Mark?
Yeah, so let's pause for a quick second, just chat real quick about the top security incidents. So every quarter, we try and highlight whatever the biggest threat to security, or at least most notable event for the quarter was. It isn't always the biggest hack. Sometimes it's just a major news story that has ramifications that may last a long time. In this case, it absolutely was the biggest hack from the quarter, and that was the attack against the Colonial Pipeline. If you're not familiar with the incident, there's a major gas and oil and petroleum product pipeline that runs along the entire east coast of the United States. And back in May, it was actually hit by a ransomware attack that took it down for several days. And while we go into it in a bit of detail in the report, we actually went into it in quite a bit more detail in a webinar that we gave a bit earlier this year. I'll go ahead and encourage you, if you want to get more information on this threat and other types of big game ransomware attacks that we've seen, Corey, if you want to hit next, go ahead and check out our report or our webinar that we ran a bit earlier on the Colonial Pipeline attack and other big game ransomware attacks. It's available on watchguard.com/webinars. And I feel like there's, if I do say so myself, quite a bit of good content in there for defending against this new plague of massive ransomware attacks that we're seeing affecting organizations all around the world. So again, we're not going to spend too much time on it just for time's sake in this webinar. So let's go ahead and then pivot over to a look at the top endpoint threats for the quarter. And I guess before we jump into that, we have another polling question, and that is, where do most malware infections originate? So when we're talking about this, when malware arrives on an endpoint, it tends to come from at least a categorized source that we can bucket it into. Do you think that they come from browser exploits, so going after vulnerabilities in your web browser or plugins that you may have, exploits in Microsoft Office or other desktop office tools, Script-based threats, so things like PowerShell, Visual Basic scripts, in-office files, or JScript, JavaScript. Adobe products, they're still kicking around, so things like Flash vulnerabilities or Java applets, which have been a pretty popular one, at least historically, and still tend to experience their fair share of vulnerabilities as well. But when we say, again, browser malware infection or origins, we're saying, where did the malware originate from? Where did it kick off its infection and able to start running on that endpoint? I mean, it looks like the shifting around is slowed down enough. We can probably show the results here. And not necessarily the majority, but the largest percentage was actually accurate in this case. And we'll get into that more in just a second. And that 43% of you picked scripts for this. And we'll talk about that more in just a second too. I'll say that those that picked browser exploits are still, I mean, you actually picked the second correct one as well. And that browser-based threats did trend up quite a bit in the last year. And even though you'll see in a second, they trended down a little bit now, they're still a pretty popular avenue. And those that picked Office exploits are not entirely incorrect in this, and that Office-based documents are still a really popular way to kick off a script-based malware infection, one that uses macros or some other method to kick off PowerShell or VB script. But Office exploits, so things going after like the equation editor vulnerabilities from 2007, or the new vulnerability in the web client of Microsoft Office that was just disclosed last month, those are still fairly popular as well. But Corey, if you want to hit the next slide, one of the things that we track in our...
We take the poll off, the next slide should be
up. If we pull the poll off and get to the next slide, one of the things that we track every single quarter in our malware volume or our malware threats is how these infections originate on a host. And if you remember back to Q4, the last time we showed this data, where we showed it on a year-by-year basis, we had a 888% increase in script-based threats from the previous year. So when we say script-based, we mean PowerShell, JavaScript, some form of living off the land attack that abuses the tools built into your operating system to basically carry out all of the malicious action on that host. Instead of downloading a malware binary and saving it on your hard drive and then running it from there, these days attackers can use PowerShell to basically do everything they need to. There's modules like PowerSploit and PowerWare that are freely available on GitHub that include highly sophisticated methods for taking any malware shellcode or binary and injecting it straight into the memory of another process and executing it from there. And because of these toolkits that are available and just the ability for these style of threats to evade detection, attackers have increasingly pivoted towards using this style of threat to kick off their attack. And in fact, like script-based threats in just the first half of this year have already reached 80% of their total 2020 detections for the previous year. So we're on pace for far exceeding even that massive increase that we saw just last year. I'd expect this line graph to continue trending up in a bit of a hockey stick style graph, again, because it's easier than ever to use these toolkits to carry out some of these evasive threats. When we look at browser-based malware, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you hear us say the buzzwords living off the land attacks, fileless attacks, that's this. And really the benefit is old school endpoint security controls don't really catch fileless malware very well. Again, they're focused on files and registry entries. And this is where you really need the more modern endpoint security that I talked about before, like EDR, that pays attention to other indicators happening on the endpoint. For instance, besides just the contextual engine, AD360 and WatchGuard EPDR have a list of what we call inline exploit protections, where we pay attention to different techniques bad guys can use to do inline memory injection, the process injection Mark was talking about. So you really want to invest in endpoint controls that are looking for these fileless attacks.
Yeah, and then the other, I guess I'm going to use the word close very loosely here, but the other threat category or malware infection origin that came relatively close to script-based threats was browser-based exploits. So going after unpatched vulnerabilities in browsers
And
or plugins
I'll
with that.
jump into that real quick. You can see here, by the way, I think Mark made this apparent, but just so you know, all of this is now our endpoint security data coming from AD360 that gives us all these trends. Because as Mark mentioned, browser vulnerabilities are another common way. So for the 38% of you that answered that, while the scale's a little lower than fileless, it definitely was a second threat. We find it interesting to also look at what browser this malware was detecting. And while it's dropped a little bit, you can see the gray line. Surprisingly, IE is still the most targeted browser, not Edge, IE. And what's interesting to us about that is depending on which statistic you look at, both IE and Edge are percentage-wise the least used browsers. IE, I think right now has about 2%. Some have it at 1% of the market. Edge only gets up to 5%. Meanwhile, Chrome, the blue line, 77% of the market uses Chrome. But despite the fact that most people are using Chrome, and by the way, Firefox is higher than IE as well, IE still seems to be the most targeted browser. That's not to say there are not vulnerabilities in Chrome and Firefox, there are, but I do think there's some legacy IE flaws that stick around. It blows me away how many people still use IE 6 or 8, very, very old versions.
Well, when you're still using Windows XP, you don't have many choices.
That's a good point. There are still literally companies and people that use Windows XP, but we think it's probably targeted because they have pretty common, exploit libraries. So interesting, despite not having kind of the top of the market, it is still the most top targeted. But also ransomware, Mark, I think we have some interesting stats there.
Yeah, so when we look at the total volume of ransomware detections over the past few years, we're actually trending downward from 2018 through 2020. But if we look at this year, though, ransomware detections actually just finished just shy of 2021. And if we kind of extrapolate this out to projections for the rest of the year, it's looking like ransomware volume in total is going to start trending back upwards for this year. And I feel like it's been a couple of years since we said ransomware is plateaued and, might be stabilizing as a threat, but it really feels like in just the past couple of years, it's taken right back off again. And a lot of that is fueled by some of these, how commoditized it is with some of these ransomware as a service offerings that you can get on the dark web, where you don't need any development skills whatsoever. You don't need any network infrastructure management skills. All you need is a little bit of social engineering, and you can become an affiliate of one of these ransomware as a service vendors and then deploy their ransomware to any victim, and they just take a little bit of a slice off the top of the payments that you get back in. And this has kind of fueled this new wave of big game ransomware attacks against organizations and MSPs, and even just more, even though it's not the same volume as it was in 2016, but more Dragnet style ransomware attacks against just really anyone that's potentially vulnerable to them. So again, it's good having our endpoint protection data back in here. Expect that to continue for the next few quarters as well. But with that, for time's sake, let's pivot into a defensive summary and some just key takeaways from the quarterly report.
Yeah, and we're going to probably go quickly this time just to get some questions, but I think you'll take the first one, Mark.
Yeah, and first and foremost, deploy a endpoint detection response safety net. And what we mean by this is endpoint protection, so EPP on its own does a great job of catching known threats pre-exploitation or pre-execution. But if you've taken nothing else away from this webinar and previous ones we've talked about, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. There's no silver bullet when it comes to security, and there's no 100% effective service out there. So you need layers of detection and layers of protection to catch threats that kind of slip through the cracks. So when we talk about EDR, we're talking about endpoint detection response capable of catching some of these evasive threats, some of these PowerShell scripts, and some of these tools that attackers use, these living off the land style attacks, to carry out and execute these threats. EDR has the ability to come in there and identify some of this suspicious activity and potentially raise enough red flags in order to stop an attack and stop it from where it would be an incident from turning into a major event for your organization. Corey, you want to nab the second one then?
Yeah, and for the second one, I'll say that this is more general advice based on things we've been seeing long term in our report. But one of the most common ways we see attackers getting in now is your intentional remote access. because of the pandemic and work at home, you still have all your servers at the office, and you need ways for your privileged users and for normal people to gain access to them. So you're obviously using things like VPN, sometimes remote desktops like RDP or VLC. And a lot of the times we absolutely see attackers targeting VPNs and RDP. Our high-level takeaways here are for VPNs. They're a good security tool. You should absolutely use them, but realize if you're just banking on credentials to protect VPN, a bad guy could potentially get one of your users' credentials and it suddenly becomes a backdoor right into your network. We, for instance, my policy at WatchGuard is to not allow VPN access without MFA, multi-factor authentication. So we use VPN for sure a lot, but we add multi-factor authentication to it to make sure attackers can't easily just from a lost or stolen credential get in. The other thing I do want to mention, RDP. A lot of folks still expose RDP to the internet remotely. I get it. One of the easiest ways to be able to access computers is just allow it to everyone on the internet, because you never know what IP you can come from. But we highly recommend you do not expose RDP to the internet. Yes, you can add MFA to our RDP2, which we do recommend, but there's been so many vulnerabilities in it that are unauthenticated. Bluekeep, some of the ones that have leaked from NSA, RDP can sometimes be popped even without a credential. So we recommend, using RDP is fine, but we recommend you put it behind a VPN with MFA. And why don't you finish off with business continuity?
Yeah, and so when it comes to security, really one thing that we always try and hammer home is that it's not a matter of if, but when it comes to a cyber attack. Like no matter what protections and defenses you have, at some point in time, someone is going to come after you and potentially succeed in compromising a system or multiple systems on your network. And so you need a backup plan. You need a way to recover from that potential incident, and you need to make sure you've tested it as well. So if you haven't already started developing and testing a business continuity and disaster recovery plan, it should be a high priority for your organization. And this covers more than just security incidents as well. Like if you've got a data center and there's a fire in your data center, how do you recover from that? How do you recover from an earthquake potentially damaging your building and your network closet in there as well? A BCDR plan basically helps you plan for these inevitabilities so that when it actually happens, you're not just flying by the seat of your pants and trying to recover there, just flinging stuff onto the wall and seeing what sticks. You have a true and tested plan, so you know, okay, this happens, here's these steps I need to take in order to recover from it and allow my business to continue at this point. Again, like I would love to tell you, working for a security company, turn on all our stuff and you're unhackable, but that's simply not the case. So you need to make sure you've got your ducks in a row in order to recover from a potential security incident going forward. So I think we've gone 2 minutes over, but as is tradition with the Mark and Corey webinars, we would love to stick around and continue asking questions as long as you all want to hang out and keep pitching questions towards us as well. Before that though, any final words, Corey?
Oh, no. I was going to say, by the way, you can keep up with everything we do at Secplicity. So definitely go to our blog where you can actually find our videos and podcasts. But let's dive into the questions for time's sake. By the way, one of the audience members mentions their first time attendee. So thank you for joining us. And it sounds like, by the way, they mentioned because of cyber insurance requirements, they kind of upped their firebox to total security to add a lot of security layers to the firebox, including IPS, all the different types of malware protection. Basically, total security gives you all the coverage from the stuff we're tracking in this report. And we hear that a lot, by the way. Cyber insurance is really, my theory is what's happened. Cyber insurance started paying ransoms for ransomware without having long-term actuary tables. And they now realize that they're paying too much and they can't support it. They're paying more out to ransom than they're taking in. So they now have more, maybe that part's not true, but it's definitely not giving them the profit they hope to have. So now they have a lot more stringent requirements on the people they insure with cybersecurity insurance or extortion insurance. You see them scanning your network a lot before giving you the price of your insurance. So it sounds like because of cyber insurance, this listener has been upping their security. And the general question is, now that I have total security, I also have AuthPoint, which is WatchGuard's multi-factor authentication product. what's the best way to find best practices for configuration stuff? So that's a great question. I think one thing is if you listen to me and Mark's podcast and you join some of our events, we often talk about little details about our proxy, about the HTTPS algorithm and what it takes to get it working well. So we do cover best practices over time in various webinars and Cyclicity content we generate. Besides that, we do definitely have a training, LearnDot. If you go to our website, you can get some training videos, and some of them don't only tell you exactly how to set up a proxy without best practices, but do talk about best practices. Do you have any other suggestions, Mark, for the best way to figure out the best practice? Yeah.
Just our technical documentation as well has a lot of best practices, and if you follow some of the quick setup wizards built into the Firebox too, in general, they will configure whatever feature or service you're trying to set up towards a good baseline of where to start from for that particular service. Another question I saw pop in here was I went to a specific website and it was blocked, and I checked the blocked sites list on the Firebox and didn't see anything related to it. Where else should I be looking? I'd say this is a great example of where having visibility, so a logging and reporting server, either Dimension or WatchGuard Cloud for the appliance, comes in real handy because there are a multitude of security services on Firebox. There's a multitude of different configurations in the HTTP and HTTPS proxy. They could potentially block access to a malicious or false positive website. In general, all of them will trigger a deny log though, every single one. And so if you can look through your logs through Dimension or WatchGuard Cloud and identify that deny log from your IP address at around that point in time, you'll get a very verbose description of exactly why that connection was blocked, and you can drill down from there.
And it's as Mark said, may not just be block sites. It may be a proxy setting. It may be DNSWatch. It may be WebLocker. There's lots of things that could block it. Search, like I would push you to WatchGuard Cloud. I think everyone should have somehow be logging historical stuff from their Firebox. But I find customers before WatchGuard Cloud, a lot of people didn't take the time to set up a log server. So they only had the traffic monitor on the Firebox itself, which could be 1 hour or 1 day only of logs, depending on how much traffic you have in your network. So WatchGuard Cloud gives you 30 days for free just by having a Firebox. So definitely utilize it. And we won't say the site out loud, but you can certainly just search for the URL in a number of different places, including traffic logs. And maybe that will quickly get you to the deny logs for whatever the reason was. Another question from Martin is HTTP inspection adds work. We'll agree with that. You know, we believe there's been a lot of, so for instance, I actually think HTTP inspection can be pretty easy to set up. We offer multiple ways to do it though. You can, at a high level, one of the ways you can do is you can export a special certificate from the Firebox and then try to find a way to get to every single browser to import that into their browser. That's a pain in the butt. That's a lot of work, even using group policy. Another way to do it is to get this similar type of special cert from your Active Directory server. If you're an AD user, Microsoft, you can get this type of cert for your organization and domain that your AD covers, and then you can import that into Firebox. Then you don't have to worry about the clients. You're using your actual corporate CA certificate on the Firebox itself. So initial setup of this can be easy. The challenge this user asked though was that certain sites may not work properly. And that is true. There's some sites that do things like HTTP or cert pinning or HTLS. They have more stringent security requirements where they make sure you can only get to them if you're using their proper cert. If that's the CA cert, they won't let you do some of the special cert in the chain that we do. And for those, you have to have exceptions. I will say, I think we've made it as easy as possible. We have a lot of the most common sites that break as pre-made exceptions in our proxy, so we've made it easy. But the truth is that when you will find it occasionally, not just sites, but sometimes applications. There's applications that are actually just a front end for a HTTPS connection. And sometimes those applications don't allow you to import certs. But for all of those cases, again, I think a lot of our pre-made exceptions cover most of those, so I'd make sure to use those. But you would have to add exceptions in some cases for those sites. Want to take another one, Mark?
Sure. So I saw a question here about EPDR, so endpoint detection, endpoint protection, and endpoint detection response, and where it comes between clicking on a malicious link in an email and the malware being potentially installed or run on the host. Basically, EPDR is your anti-malware engine on steroids, along with some detection capabilities behind it as well. So if your user clicks on a link and goes to a malicious site, EPDR actually has some domain blocking built into it as well that could potentially block that connection too. If it doesn't and the malware payload gets downloaded on the endpoint, the EPP portion of it can potentially identify that malware as soon as it touches the endpoint as well. And then if for some reason it's like highly evasive or it's using some form of evasion techniques to get past that portion, EDR has the opportunity to catch it as it begins to run, just through contextual engine and other methods of identifying that suspicious activity on that endpoint.
Cool. The next question is, I'll paraphrase it, but it's essentially the question. It sounds like this user might have Adaptive Defense 360, our endpoint protection product, and they're basically asking, if I have that, do I need extra protection on the Firebox, or is it just is it important to turn on Firebox malware protection, or can I do with just AD360 alone? Now, I personally believe, and I'll share a little WatchGuard strategy with you, that everyone needs both endpoint and network protection. And for the most sophisticated threats, you need both working together and sharing information with each other, because there's evasion techniques that malware uses at the endpoint and that malware uses at the network. And because both have evasion techniques, having both working in concert gives you a higher chance of catching things. So the short answer is, if I have WatchGuard's anti-malware prevention and EDR on my endpoint, do I really need the malware protection of the Firebox? Maybe you could get away without it, but I highly recommend it. Some of the reasons are: one, defense in depth. Just so you know, we own, of course, all the malware prevention technologies in AD360. If we wanted to, we could make the gateway antivirus on the Firebox our Panda engine. We haven't. We actually use a third-party engine, Bitdefender, as well as our APT blocker and also our IAV come from Cylance, now VMware, I guess. I'm sorry, now BlackBerry, I guess. And Lastline, which is now VMware. So we made a concentrated effort to actually not use the same AV engine on the Firebox as we do with the endpoint, because it doubles up on the protection. I actually think our Panda AV engine catches a lot more than other third-party stuff. I'm a little biased, but it's still good to have a different engine on the network because it kind of overlays extra protections. More importantly, though, is the evasion techniques I alluded to. For instance, rootkits, especially kernel-based rootkits, can trick a lot of endpoint agents. Without going into hours of detail, a rootkit uses all kinds of really deep operating system tricks or kernel level tricks to do a Jedi mind trick on the operating system itself. When Windows lists the processes that are running, a kernel level rootkit can say, oh, here are all the processes, but you don't see this one process, or the network connections from the endpoint. Oh, here are all the network connections, but I'm going to hide this one. That's what a kernel rootkit does. And while AV products like ours, you know, a Panda software, does have a kernel level driver that tries to still look up things in different ways to avoid these technologies, it's theoretically very possible that a rootkit could hide a file, a registry entry, a network connection from any local endpoint process. But that doesn't mean the network connection doesn't exist. It still has to call home, and your network protection has a chance to catch that. And if that command and control connection is passing malware, now we have a network-based way to catch that malware. And that works in reverse too. Are network malware protections enough? No, because there's different ways to evade network-based security controls too. So having endpoint protection is good too. So for the best defense in depth, I think it's great to have malware detection at both the network and the endpoint layer. And in fact, we have seen that both types catch different stages of malware. Like network seems to be very good at catching stagers and downloaders before they actually even download the actual child payload like ransomware. Meanwhile, if some new technique comes out for a stager to evade network protection, the endpoint is a great place to actually catch it because that's where a lot of the action happens. So I personally think both are good. You should definitely have malware protection on one of those though, for sure.
Yep. Question on here about when we talked about DNS Watch and some of the phishing domains. If you've got WebBlocker as a security service on your Firebox, does it include the same domains as DNS Watch? And I'll say there is a significant overlap, but not 100% overlap, just because, like Corey said, we go with different vendors, different feeds for each of our security services. So you've got kind of a mesh over it. DNS Watch is on the Firebox as well under Total Security. It's literally just a checkbox you turn on in order to enable that feature. But if you've got WebBlocker, the other additional benefit of that is looking at more than just the domain. You can look at the full URI, where there's some threats that you can't block at a domain level without blocking access to an entire legitimate website or infrastructure. WebBlocker has the ability to look at the entire URI path and potentially block those threats as well. So that is one benefit of having additional layers of security with different technologies blocking at different spots. I see there was a question
I'll
here.
Answer one real quick. Quarter to quarter false positive numbers have one of the questions was, has our false positives in the report evolved over 2021? I'll say first, good question. And maybe if you guys are interested, we should track that. But long story short, we actually actively remove false positives before we launched the report. There's situations in the past, for instance, where IPS numbers rose hugely. And then when we actually looked at the data, we found millions coming from a couple fireboxes. And in those cases, we try to work with sales to see if it's worth contacting a customer to see if it was them just being targeted heavily or a false positive. But what eventually happens is if we believe it's a false positive, we remove the data from the report. So historically, we haven't tracked false positives in our report at all, but do know we're actually removing some of the numbers because we're doing some analysis to see what we believe is true trends versus something that could be a false positive.
Yep.
Go ahead, Mark.
Next question, what happened to the daily security bites? I'd say that one's probably comes down to Corey hasn't found a way to clone himself yet.
Yeah, Mark's welcome to try them. My goal is to do them again because I love to do them. But now that I'm an executive, it's just hard to find any time in any day. So if I can clone myself, they were probably the most fun part of my previous job, but I simply have had trouble finding time for them. I'm hoping that others might contribute to daily security, or at least a couple times a week security videos. But I do have one of my goals to get some of them back. So thank you for asking. That does inspire me to try to get into it.
Good deal.
With that, it seems like we're getting a ton of questions. I probably do have to drop off, and I want to be sensitive to your time. But after these webinars, Alicia and other folks help consolidate some of the questions we weren't able to answer. So we might be able to follow up in an email for some of the rest of the questions. But thank you so much, everyone, for your time in doing this. We really appreciate you joining, and hopefully you learned something that can help you defend your network in your organization.
Yep, and if you want to check out the report, it's watchguard.com/security report. Check it out there, and thanks again, everyone, for hopping on.
Thanks again, everybody. Just one thing to keep in mind, in the chat, I left the link to the report, and after we finish the webinar, a survey is going to pop up. We would love to hear what you have to say about this webinar. Have a great day, and thanks for being here today.